Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're bringing down the Tuesday, December 19th slate of college basketball DFS. We've got a nice little 8-game slate on DraftKings. If I must say so myself, this is a very appealing slate to me. You've got some really big-time conference matchups, as well as some different non-conference games, and you got a lot of value on the DraftKings slate and on the FanDuel slate as well, even though the FanDuel slate's a little smaller. And so to me, this night is going to be all about, how can we find the value? Which ones of these value plays are going to hit? Which ones do we need to fade? And so it's just going to be a really interesting night to build lineups. And I really am looking forward to it. I think this is one of the more intriguing college basketball slates that we've had in a while. Now, before we get started, though, I do want to talk about our schedule for the next week. So tomorrow night, we're probably going to be back talking college football. We're going to talk about all the Saturday bowl games for college football because there is another, I believe, 6 games this Saturday for college football that we're going to break down and get our DFS preview for that out. And then Wednesday night, we're looking to have the NFL show for week 16 a little bit early because I'm actually going to be headed out of town on Thursday. I'm actually headed to Georgia to my grandparents' house to celebrate our family Christmas there a little bit early. So I'm going to be out of town Thursday through Sunday. We'll not have a show on Christmas Day, and then hope to be back with the regular college football, college basketball, NFL content next week. But the bottom line is we are going to get you this college basketball episode and another college football episode and hopefully an NFL episode before we do head out of town. So that way, all the normal weekly content rolls on as planned. Also, next week, be on the lookout for a new golf show. We're going to try previewing the 2024 PGA Tour season with a little bit of a different type of episode, different way of doing that. This should be fun. And so if you are interested in playing any fantasy golf, you're going to want to check that out. So bottom line is make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the audio feed as well. So that way you can get notified when all these new episodes drop and you will never miss a beat, whether it is the college basketball, college football, NFL, or golf content that you were looking for. We got it all covered here on Mike's Money Picks. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. We've got an 8-game slate. We're going to break it down game by game and tell you, what you can expect from each of these games and how we are going to attack and target each of these 8 games. So let's go ahead and kick things off with game number 1. All right, so the first game of the night is going to be Morehead State taking on Indiana. And this one is not the best game environment on the slate, but it's also far from the worst of it as well. It's projected to be Indiana 77-67 according to Ken Pom. What's really interesting is that we saw this Morehead State team on the opening night of the season way back in November. They were taking on Alabama, and there was a guy that we actually got this right about. He was priced at even 3K back then. His name's Riley Minix. He is their best player. He was a transfer from an NAIA school up to Morehead State, and this is a guy who can absolutely fill up the stat sheet. He does a lot in terms of points, rebounds, assists. He averages over a block and over a steal per game as well. He's their highest usage player. So real interesting that the guy all the way back from night 1 of the season is a guy who actually turned out to be their best player, and really cool to see Morehead State back on the slate. Unfortunately, now he is at $8,800, and with their with his price tag being that high and Morehead State's projected team total to be 67, it just puts him in a really tough spot. Also, the interesting thing is with Morehead State is that they have played 3 tough teams so far this season. They have played Penn State, Purdue, and Alabama. And in those 3 games, Riley Minix has failed to eclipse 32 fantasy points in all 3 of those games. So while he's having a really cool, really fun season for Morehead State, it's in a really tough spot for him at that salary, taking on an Indiana team that is one of the best teams that they're going to play all season. Now, Drew Thelwell is probably their second best overall player and has their second best statistical profile. He's got a really high usage rate, really high assist rate. But the problem with Thelwell is that he's got the same issue that Minix has. When you look at the 3 games they've played against quality competition, he has not eclipsed 15 fantasy points in any of those 3 games. So, both of these guys have really done a lot of their damage against worse competition, and Indiana is not going to be that for them. The other guy who interests me is going to be Deontay Miles. He is a true 7-footer, but bigs playing against the Indiana is kind of tough with Kellel Ware down there, but I think that they may need Miles to play more minutes than he usually does just because of Indiana's size and because of the problems that that's going to present to him. And you do see in the game log with Deontay Miles, he has 3 games over 22 fantasy points this season. In a salary of $4,200, that's a legitimate ceiling. And I think there's definitely worse options out there than Deontay Miles, but it is definitely a tough ask to go up against this Indiana front. So, speaking of that Indiana front court, well, how can we target this Indiana team? Well, here's the downside of targeting Indiana. Morehead State ranks 307th in the nation in adjusted tempo, according to KenPom. So this is not a super appealing spot for these Indiana guys. This is a pace down game for them. They're not going to be getting as many possessions, as many opportunities as they're accustomed to. So for them to, reach the same level of production, they're going to have to be, more efficient with the basketball than they normally are. But the good news is with Indiana, though, is that Xavier Johnson has been out for a while. That's not the good news part. The good news is that they've been fairly predictable since he has been out, and we kind of know what we're going to get from these guys as long as Xavier Johnson is out. Kella Ware is a double-double machine. He's a guy who blocks a lot of shots as well, and he's had some ceiling games in the game log so far this year. He's been a little cold from the field in each of his last two games, and I think if he were to be a little bit more efficient from the field, you could get a ceiling game from Kella Ware in this game. Malik Renew is a high floor option at the forward position. He's not going to be likely to break the slate, but he's not a guy who's probably going to kill your lineup either. Mackenzie Mgbako. Holy crap, I butchered that. Mackenzie Mgbako is a guy who has seen his usage uptick quite a bit with the Xavier Johnson injury. He's a super talented freshman. He's probably going to propose a pretty big matchup problem for Morehead State. And so I think he's a pretty solid option as well. If Xavier Johnson continues to be out and he continues to see that increased usage. Speaking of that, Trey Galloway has really been the guy who's picked it up since Xavier Johnson has been out. In the 4 games that Johnson has missed, Galloway has put up 29.5 and 31.75 in that span. The only bad news is that the other two are 14 and 9.75. So he's been a little bit hit or miss, but he's definitely a guy who brings some legitimate upside if Johnson continues to miss. And then you've got Gabe Cupps, who has kind of been the guy who saw the minutes that Xavier Johnson was getting. He's played 30 minutes in each of the last 3 games. Unfortunately, he's been a member of the cardio club for most of that. He doesn't take a lot of shots. He doesn't have a very high usage rate. He doesn't do a whole lot on the floor with those minutes. However, in the Auburn game, which was a game that they lost by almost 30 points, he did put up 25 fantasy points in that one, took 6 shots, which was a season high, grabbed 5 boards, dished out 2 assists as well. So the potential is there, and with that occurring in a blowout, I kind of think that there's a chance that could happen again in this one if they do end up blowing out Morehead State. That Gabe Cupps does see another performance where he is a little more ball dominant and a little more high usage of a player if the game is out of hand early. Now, the next game of the night is going to be Georgetown taking on Butler. According to KenPom, this one is projected to be Butler 83-70, and that is the highest total on the slate of any team for the Butler Bulldogs. So that certainly makes me have some interest in them. Let's talk about Georgetown first, though. So Georgetown has played each of the last 2 games without their point guard, and in my opinion, their best player, Jaden Epps, he's battling an illness. So I don't know, man. Like, it's kind of rare to see an illness span like multiple weeks. So I would tend to think that Epps is going to be back sooner than later. With them projected 70 points, I think Epps is definitely in play. I wouldn't cross him out, but coming off from an illness, that should be something that he's able to come back and play his normal role and see his normal production. Now, with Jaden Epps out, what you did see in those 2 games was a usage bump for Rowan Brumbaugh as well as Jay Heath. Both of those guys have been spectacular, kind of sharing the point guard duties in each of the past 2 games. I would be very interested in them again if Jaden Epps was out, but if Epps is going to play, I'm not going to play either of those 2 guys. The only other guy I would be interested in for Georgetown is Ismail Massoud. He's a transfer from Kansas State that has really kind of came into the season guns a-blazing. He's played 30 minutes in every game that he has played this season. He didn't start the season on time. I believe he had an injury he was dealing with. And he's shown a legitimately high ceiling. He had a 42 fantasy point performance against TCU. He's taken double-digit shots in 4 straight games. He's a guy that his price tag is kind of starting to settle in a little bit. He's at $6,800 now, which is the most expensive he's been all season. But I definitely think he has the potential to hit value at that price tag, even though it is boosted up just a little bit. Now, with Butler, with their side being projected to get to 83 points, I feel like we got to get a piece of this Butler lineup, right? It definitely makes me interested in some of these guys. Jamil Telfort is their primary big man, and he has had a big-time ceiling this season. He's had a 50 fantasy point performance as well as a 43 fantasy point performance. And look, if you're going to get that at $7,600, that is slate-breaking potential for him. Posh Alexander is another guy that I'm really intrigued by. He is pretty correlated to Butler's totals. Like, when Butler has higher totals, he tends to have higher fantasy point totals. And it makes sense because he is their assist leader, he also grabs some boards as well. So in games where there's more possessions, he's going to be able to fill up the stat sheet because he's going to have more opportunities to fill up the stat sheet. And he's a guy that I think if you're looking to play multiple pieces from the Butler Bulldogs, he's a guy that I think you got to have in there. I think you can go Telfort and Alexander. I think you can go Alexander in some of the more value plays as well. Two of those value plays that I would be interested in are DJ Davis as well as Andre Screen. Both of those guys this season have shown legitimate ceiling upside without playing super big minute totals or having super big consistent roles. But if you're looking for upside for a team that's going to score a lot of points, Davis and Screen are two guys that fit that category. Now, for the Florida at Michigan game, this is game number 3 of the night. This is the first game of the FanDuel slate. This is the highest game total of the night, according to Ken Palm. It's projected to be 81-80 in favor of Florida. Florida ranked 16th in the nation in tempo, so it's a big-time pace-up spot for Michigan. Now, what has been interesting with Florida is that in their last 2 games, Will Richard has actually been their highest-scoring guard from a fantasy perspective, which is not something that happens very often at all for them. But when you look at the reason that he's done it, it hasn't been because he's seen this big bump in usage or he's taken, an exorbitant amount of shots. It's really come from the fact that he's grabbed a lot of rebounds in each of the last 2 games. He's grabbed a lot more rebounds than Riley Kugel and Walter Clayton and Zion Poland, who are the other guards he's kind of competing against for that. And he's also shot the ball really well. 8 for 12 from the field against Richmond, 4 for 12 from the field against, or 4 for 10 from the field against ECU. That's not bad for a guard and kind of on par with his season performance. So, I don't necessarily think that that's something that we can go back to. I would be more willing to go back to Richard if it were a definite shift in the number of shots he's getting. The fact that he's just being more efficient and filling up the boards, that doesn't really necessarily make me super intrigued to keep going back to that. So the guard that I'm willing to go back to is Walter Clayton Jr. He still leads the team in usage on the season. He still has multiple ways of filling up a stat sheet. He can get you a lot of points as well as rebounds and assists. Really he's kind of hasn't been super high on the rebounds and assists in recent weeks. So if he does bring it back to, the player he was at the start of the season with rebounds and assists, he could be in for a big time night. Now, Micah Hanloten, the big fella for Florida, is back in the lineup. He played 26 minutes against ECU. Really, they are only playing the 2 bigs, Hanloten and Samuel, now that he's back in the lineup. And I think both of them, merit mentioning here on this show. Samuel has shown a high ceiling this season. Hanloten, if he's going to play a full minute load against this Michigan team, has definitely a chance to hit 5 times value. So I would be interested in those 2 guys as well. Now for Michigan, we've seen this Michigan team multiple times this season. The primary 2 guys that I'm going to continue to be interested in are Doug McDaniel and Olivier Nkamwa, just because those 2 guys dominate the usage so much for this Wolverines team. They're the only 2 guys on the team who have a usage rate north of 20%, and both of their usage rates are north of 25%. So with these 2 guys dominating all the production, it's really hard to get excited about either of the other pieces for Michigan. But the good news is that with them being projected to score 80 points, you're either going to get a ceiling game from McDaniel or Nkamwa, or maybe one of these other guys just might have a ceiling game as well. And because they're not really accustomed to having ceiling games, they're priced at a very affordable spot. Terrace Reed Jr. has really come on strong as of lately with 30 fantasy points in back-to-back games. I'm kind of okay with him. I think if I were to play him, I would probably play McDaniel and Reed together. Reed's production has come from, a little bit of a boost in minutes, but primarily a boost in rebounding and block shots. And that's something that he's going to have a chance to do against this Florida Gators team. Namari Burnett's also a guy that we've seen have a ceiling game earlier in the season. Against Memphis, he had 39 fantasy points. Against St. John's, he had 28. So, if this game does get going back and forth, Namari Burnett is definitely a guy who is capable of putting up a big total. So I think that, while McDaniel and Nkamwa are going to be the primary guys I'm interested in off this Michigan squad, I definitely think you can supplement it with Terrace Reed and Namari Burnett. I do want to give a mention to Jalen Llewellyn. He was a really talented freshman last year who was recovering from a season-ending injury. He played 15 minutes against ECU, didn't really do much with it, only 7.75 fantasy points, but I think it's only a matter of time before he starts becoming a regular contributor to this Wolverines rotation. All right, last game of this segment is going to be Virginia at Memphis. And look, if there's one game that you're just going to cross off of your list tomorrow night, then it would be this one for me. This one is projected to be Memphis 67-65. Memphis, they're a team that we love to target, right? They play at the 19th ranked tempo in the nation. They have guys with some of the highest ceilings in all of fantasy basketball. But they're taking on Virginia, who plays at 361st ranked tempo in the nation. For reference, there's 365 teams in Division I college basketball, and they rank second overall in defensive efficiency on KenPom. So you're getting not only a team that plays super slow, but super good defensively. And so it just makes me kind of want to just cross off Memphis entirely and go from there. Now, with it being a big time pace up spot for Virginia, that does give me interest in some of their guys like Reese Beekman, who is a really consistent option, just been super consistent all season long, fills up the stat sheet in a variety of ways. If this game were to take off, it would probably be a big total for Reese Beekman. However, when we're looking at this Virginia team, a big time cause of concern and cause of interest for me has been what they've been doing at the center position. So they've been starting Jake Groves, who is not bad, but he hasn't had any really big time performances, even in games where he's played a lot of minutes. He's not a big time fantasy point per minute guy. And that comes at the expense of the guy that was starting the season at center for them, Blake Buchanan, a guy that I was excited about at the start of the season. He had a really solid start of the season and has kind of faded a little bit since. And then what they're also doing is Ryan Dunn, who's listed as a guard on DraftKings, he's been playing some minutes at the small ball 5. And if you're looking at his game log, it hasn't led to a lot of production for him, which is weird because you would think that it really would, a guy with his skill set and being such a good rebounder playing the 5 spot. But it really hasn't. So it's been a situation that's been kind of a mess for them. Now, one thing it has done is with Ryan Dunn playing more at the 5, it's opened up some minutes for Elijah Gertrude, who's only $3,400 on DraftKings. And he really just started playing games at the end of November. He's played in 4 games this season. He's played in at least 15 minutes in each of the last 3 games. He's put up at least 13 fantasy points in each of the last 3 games, which might not sound like a whole lot, but when you're only $3,400, that's 3 times value for your salary. So Elijah Gertrude, definitely one of the value plays that are going to be in my player pool for Tuesday night. Now, on the Memphis side, like I said, it almost feels painful to cross off this team because of how good some of these guys have been to us in DFS this year. Like David Jones, we talked about him early in the season being a transfer from St. John's, having a lot of upside, not a lot of consistency. Well, that's been the case for him, and he's had some upside games. He's had 5 games, over 40 fantasy points so far this season. But when you're only projected to score 67 points and you're used to scoring about 80, it's just going to be really hard for a lot of these guys to hit value. In fact, when you look at the last game where Memphis played a really slow, really good defensive team, they only scored 63 points against Villanova, and none of the starters reached 4 times value for their salary in that game. So it makes it really tough to want to target Memphis guys. Now, what you are getting, though, is Jordan Brown is probably going to miss this game again. I don't really know what's up with his situation or if he's still with the team or not, but as long as he continues to miss, Malcolm Dandridge as well as Nick Jourdain are going to see boosted minutes. And with their price tags only being $5,000 and $4,100, I think they're guys that you got to consider, especially considering what we talked about with the Virginia center position, how they're going small, how it's kind of a mess and they don't really know what they're doing. That's a spot where these guys can really be taken advantage of there on the interior. All right, that does it for the first 4 games. So let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then we're going to break down the second half. Now, before we get started with these last 4 games, I do want to mention there are some places where you can get more information from me. First off, you can follow me on X at Mike's Money Picks. I try my best to tweet out the DFS rundown for every college basketball and college football slate, where I kind of highlight some of my categorical plays, as well as if there's any injuries that update my opinions or any information pertaining to updates for the podcast or for the YouTube channel. I do try to get them out there on X. So if you give me that follow, you'll be always informed on what's going on and where my thoughts are. I'm also more than happy to answer any start, sit, or lineup questions on X as well. But really, one of my favorite places to be is in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube and on the audio feed. We have had a lot of big time winners in college basketball in the Discord so far this season. And we're looking to add to it every single night. We've got a lot of smart people who do a lot of talking and a lot of bouncing ideas off each other. And it's just a really fun community to be a part of. I cannot recommend it enough. We got some discussion for college basketball, college football, NBA, NFL, and more. And I cannot recommend it enough. If you're looking to get better at DFS, talking with people who are also good at DFS is going to help you out big time. And then lastly, I do write up a full article for every college basketball slate on my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. I highlight all of my core plays as well as kind of my lineup and attack strategy from the slate. I'm not going to sit here and say that you're going to instantly win GPPs just from reading those articles, but I do my best to kind of get a lot of information out there and give you guys some strategy and, kind of some ways to help navigate and build your lineups every night. And that's something that not a lot of people do for college basketball and college football. Lastly, if you're looking to try something new this college basketball season, I know there are some states that might be getting sports gambling legal on January 1st. So if you're looking for the best offers and promo codes for any DFS site, player prop, or sportsbook site, head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike'sPicks. We're partnered with SignUpExpert, and what they do is they give you the best offer and promo code for a new user on any DFS, player prop, or sportsbook site. Underdog is on there. All the main sports books are on there. And so if you're looking to try anything new, head on over there, get yourself a good offer and good promo code, and make sure that you're getting the best bonus you can possibly get. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk about the second half of the slate. So believe it or not, against all odds, Western Carolina versus Vanderbilt is actually one of the best game environments of the slate. I think I was thinking Western Kentucky from that bowl game earlier today, but Western Carolina, the state I'm in, ironically, is one of the best game environments of the slate as they're taking on Vanderbilt. So this game's projected to be, according to KenPom, Western Carolina 74-72. KenPom not loving the Commodores. So, why is this the case? Well, Vanderbilt does not rank out very well defensively. They do not really force a lot of turnovers. They don't really do a whole lot well, and their rotation is kind of a mess. So how can Western Carolina take advantage of that? Well, Western Carolina has one of the best fantasy options on the entire slate, and that is Vontarius Woolbright. He has a massive 35% usage rate, which is top 10 in all college basketball, and it is certainly the leader on this slate. He's $9,200 on this DraftKings slate, and you could argue that he is even underpriced. He's hit 40 fantasy points or more in 6 straight games, and I'll be honest, he does so much, averaging 20, 21, 11.8, and 5.2 assists per game. He does so much that I'm almost not really all that interested in a whole lot of the Western Carolina pieces other than him, because it's going to be hard for them to hit value. Now, there are a few kind of lower tier value plays that I'm willing to play, like Russell Jones Jr. as well as DJ Campbell. They're both starting guards who play a lot of minutes, and they can have decent games, and not a big price tag to pay off in a game where they're projected to score 74 points. But the guy I really like as a value for Western Carolina is Charles Lampton. So he is their biggest guy in their rotation. He's the only guy in their rotation above 6'9". And basically, when he plays double-digit minutes, he hits 4 times value more often than he doesn't. It's just a question of whether he's going to play double-digit minutes. And with him being their primary size against a bigger team like Vanderbilt, I could definitely make a case for him to play some bigger minutes, like he did against UNC Asheville, where he played 19 minutes going up against Drew Pember, put up 16 fantasy points, which doesn't sound like a lot. That's 5 times value for a salary of only $3,300. Now for Vanderbilt, I mentioned how they've been kind of a mess, and that's been because they have 2 really good guards. They don't really play all that well together. And they're Tyron Lawrence and Ezra Mannion, and their averages next to their name look really good for their price tag, but it's because both of their best performances came when the other was out injured. And ever since the both of them have been playing together, neither of them have shown the ability to consistently hit 4 times value for their current salary. So I'm either willing to wait and see the prices drop even more, or wait for one of them to kind of take a hold of the usage leader and see who this team's alpha player actually is going to be before I start playing them again in DFS. Now, a guy that I am interested in for them is Van Allen Lubin. So we mentioned how they are undersized. Well, Western Carolina is undersized. Well, Van Allen Lubin is a guy who could take advantage of that. He hasn't played the whole season either, but he has 2 games over 30 fantasy points, and he is probably their best option at the forward position. So I think he's, just based off of sheer talent, he's got a chance to have a pretty big game against Western Carolina. And then the other guy that I'm interested in is Malik Presley, who's only $3,200. Seemingly out of nowhere against Texas Tech, he played 20 minutes, put up 15 fantasy points, which again doesn't sound like a lot, but he's only $3,200. So that's about 5 times value for his salary. So, if he does happen to play more minutes, then he could be a guy who could give you a decent boost in terms of just a guy that you can play at $3,200 and get solid production out of. And he gets dual eligibility as well at guard and forward. So there's a little bit of a versatility option there in Malik Presley. Can he repeat that performance? I don't know. It seemed like it was kind of out of nowhere, but at $3,200, it doesn't cost a whole lot to find out. And, there's a lot of guys on this slate that are in that $3,200 to $3,500 range that I think you can just cycle through when you make your lineups. Put, sprinkle one in here, sprinkle one in there, and maybe one of them goes off, and that's the guy that you need. Now, the next game we're going to talk about is going to be Troy at Ole Miss. And so this one is projected to be Ole Miss 79 to 69, according to KenPom. Troy ranks 66th in the nation in tempo, which is pretty solid, but Ole Miss is 287th. Look, Ole Miss is already playing beard ball. Like, as a guy who watched, Chris Beard coach Texas for a season and a half, that's the way Chris Beard wants to play. He wants to play slow. He wants to play great defensive basketball. And if it is your team, you kind of love it. But if it's not your team, you kind of hate it. And so this is not a great spot for Troy because of that reason. And really, they haven't had a whole lot of consistency yet this season. They haven't really had a great start of the season so far. And Christian Eugene is by far their most consistent player. But unfortunately, he's priced like very fairly by DraftKings at $7,700. Like, if he came in at $6,700, I would be all over him. But $7,700, that's a lot to pay for a guy who's, in a major pace down spot and only projected to score 69 points for his team. Victor Valdez for Troy is a guy that I do want to mention, though. He's probably their best value option. He's only $3,700, and he was recently inserted into the starting lineup. He's played at least 15 minutes in the last 3 games. He's put up at least 11.75 fantasy points in the last 3 games, which, again, I've said this a few times, doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when he's only $3,700, that's 3 times value for his salary. Maybe he plays, 5 extra minutes. Maybe he grabs a few extra boards, and there's your guy that gets 4 or 5 times value off the bench, not even off the bench. He's in the starting lineup now, and that's a guy that can help build out a lineup. Now, for Ole Miss, they run everything through their backcourt, through their guards. Alan Flanagan, Matthew Morrell, and Jalen Murray. All 3 of them feature very high usage rates. It's very difficult for all 3 of them to get there in the same game. If I were to play one of them, it would probably be Morrell, just because watching him the last 2 years, I think he's pretty darn talented. He tends to take a lot of shots, and then when he does fill up the stat sheet in the peripherals is when he does end up with a big-time performance. But I recently watched this Troy team play Dayton, and Deron Holmes of Dayton really, really gave Troy issues. Now, Deron Holmes is a really good basketball player. Deron Holmes is going to play in the NBA. Ole Miss doesn't have any guys like that in the front court, but Jamin Brakefield at $7,000 is a guy that could take advantage of this Troy front court in the same way that Deron Holmes did. Brakefield has shown high upside so far this season. He's been over 39 fantasy points in 2 of his last 6 games. And so you got a little bit of upside there with a solid matchup. I definitely think there's worse plays on the slate than Jamin Brakefield, and I don't think he's going to particularly be very highly owned, just because when you look at the game log and the price tag, a lot of people are going to just kind of shy away from it. Now, one thing that is interesting to monitor for Ole Miss is they did get Brandon Murray, a transfer from Georgetown, played his first game with the NCAA's transfer ruling against Cal on Saturday. He played 17 minutes in that game, only put up 12 fantasy points. Y'all, one thing that's going to be really interesting for the next few weeks is navigating this NCAA transfer ruling where all these 2-time transfers are going to be able to start playing as of now. And this is one that I think as the season goes on, he's going to play more and more minutes. So it might take away a little bit from some of these other guards. The guy that it seemed to really take away from, which I was kind of sad to see, he's been one of our favorite value plays this year, is TJ Caldwell. Saw his minutes reduced greatly with Brandon Murray back in the lineup. So, I can kind of cross TJ Caldwell off of that value player pool with Brandon Murray expected to take more and more of his minutes. Now, last 2 games of the night. The next one is going to be Winthrop taking on South Carolina. So this one is projected to be South Carolina by a score of 77 to 67. For Winthrop specifically, my main interest is going to be in Kason Harrison. He leads this team in overall usage. He leads this team in overall shot rate as well, and he can really fill up the stat sheet with rebounds and assists. Also, he just gives you a lot of pathways of hitting value in terms of fantasy. Now, he hasn't been great. He hasn't hit 4 times value in each of his last 3 games, but he's been kind of cold shooting from the field. Hasn't really hit his averages from the periphery stats either. So I would definitely expect better things out of him in this one. And this is the type of game where, against South Carolina, if Winthrop is going to keep this game close, it's probably going to be because of Kason Harrison having a big-time performance. Now, the other guy that, well, not other guy that I'm really interested in, but kind of the quirk of Winthrop's lineup that I have noticed is that they've played a lot of minutes of KJ Doucet at the 5, and that's nothing against KJ Doucet, but he's only 6'7". He's not a very big guy, and I think they've kind of gotten away with that against some of the smaller teams that they've played. I don't think they're going to be able to get away with that against South Carolina. South Carolina has BJ Mack, who is a big fella. He's priced at $7,500, and he has shown a legitimate ceiling so far this season. He has 3 games over 30 fantasy points. So BJ Mack could very well take big-time advantage of this very small Winthrop front court. And then whenever you're talking about South Carolina, you got to talk about Michi Johnson. So Michi Johnson had a run a few weeks back where he had 3 straight games of over 40 fantasy points. He is this team's leader in usage. And any time that you've shown the upside to go over 40 3 times in a row, that's a guy that's got to get consideration for some of your lineups. And, this is not the worst game environment to target with it being 77 to 67. So if this game does end up going back and forth, I could see like a Johnson, Mack, and Kason Johnson build, getting over 100 combined fantasy points from those 3 guys, I do not think would be out of the question. So definitely some options in this South Carolina game to build out your lineups. Now, from the value perspective, Miles Studi has a really solid per game average for his price tag, but he's pretty volatile to play because offensively, he's really just a spot shooter. He does not take a whole lot of shots outside of catch and shoot 3-pointers. And when they don't go in, he does not have a good fantasy night. And so that kind of gives him a very narrow pathway to getting to value. But the one time that he does have a big night, the one night he does get hot, that's a time where you're going to want him in your lineup. So only $4,100. Again, he's got to get a little consideration if you're going to stack this game, but I think you can definitely avoid it. But the one good thing about stacking him is that because he is a spot shooter, a lot of his baskets are assisted on. So you can kind of double dip if you were to play a Michi Johnson or a Taylon Cooper, as well as Miles Studi. That way you can kind of make sure you're getting the points and assists for whenever Studi scores. Now, the last game of the night is going to be Marquette taking on Providence. This is the game of the night, in my opinion. This is a really solid matchup between 2 teams that have looked pretty good so far at this point in the season. And the one thing I don't like, though, is that this game is strength against strength. More on that in a second. The projection for this one, KenPom has this one projected to be Marquette 75 to 70. So not as much of scoring as we would like to see from Marquette. We know that they can end up with some games getting high totals, but I was expecting to see that number a little higher than it came in at. I'm not going to lie. Now, for Marquette, Tyler Kolek is their guy, right? He's one of the best point guards in the nation. He has shown a big-time fantasy ceiling this season with having 3 games over 40 fantasy points, 1 game over 50 fantasy points. But the problem is that I would expect him to be defended by Providence's Devin Carter in this game. Devin Carter missed the last game that Providence played with an illness. I would expect him to be back for this one, with this being a big Big East game. And Devin Carter's a great perimeter defender. He's a guy who has a high steal rate. He's a guy who is really long and athletic at the guard position. I could see that giving Kolek issues. But on the other hand, what if they line up and they say, oh, we're going to guard Cam Jones with Devin Carter? I think that's also a possibility as well. And so I think that whichever Marquette guard doesn't end up being guarded by Devin Carter is going to end up with a pretty big-time performance. Like I can really envision a scenario where one of these Marquette guards goes off and the other is like an absolute dud. Now, also, if both of the guards are kind of, struggling, it could lead to a big night from Oso Iguodala. We've seen that from him as well. Back-to-back games over 30 fantasy points. He has a lot of ways to fill up his stat sheet. He is a true 5-man who plays a lot of minutes because of his propensity to stay out of foul trouble, which is really important to this team's success. More on that later. Now, another guy that I would be interested in for Marquette is Chase Ross. So Stevie Mitchell missed last game, and Ross has really been solid each of the last 2 games for Marquette. He's played over 25 minutes in each of those last 2 games, and he put up 22 and 24 fantasy points in both those games. He's only $4,800. If Stevie Mitchell is out again, I think that makes Ross a really, really easy click. The only downside is with Stevie Mitchell, this is the last game of the night. So you're really going to be waiting on a late swap if you have Ross in there and you're waiting on Mitchell news before you make that final determination. I would tend to think he's not going to play because it's a hamstring injury, but this is their I think this is their Big East opener, and this is a big-time game. So if he can play, he's definitely going to, but I don't think you want to rush him back with a hamstring injury. Now, on the Providence side of things, we already mentioned Devin Carter, who's also in a tough spot himself, going up against Tyler Kolek, who is also a good perimeter defender. So I don't necessarily think this is the best spot to play Devin Carter. And the downside also is for Providence is that Bryce Hopkins had his best game of the season last game when Devin Carter was out. So, like, if Carter's going to be playing, and he ends up getting locked up by Kolek, could that lead to a big-time performance from Bryce Hopkins? I certainly think it's a possibility. It's not out of the question. I could, kind of like with the Marquette guys, I can envision a scenario where one of those two guys goes off and the other is an absolute dud. I probably would not pair them both together in the same lineup. In fact, in terms of a cost perspective, it'd be quite difficult to do so. Now, for the rest of the Providence lineup, Josh Aduro is a guy that I'm going to be interested in. We've talked about time and time again over the last 2 seasons how you can target big men against Marquette. Because Oso Ighodaro stays out of foul trouble, he tends to not play very physical at times, which keeps him on the floor, which allows other opposing bigs to get some rebounds, to get some points, to get some, some extra buckets. So I definitely think that Oduro is going to be an option for me for Providence. And, there hasn't really been a whole lot of big-time performances against Oso Ighodaro so far this season. But I think as we get into Big East play, and these coaches know this, these coaches know how Marquette plays, I definitely think that's going to be something that continues moving forward. And so Oduro might start that trend here with their first game of Big East play. The Providence value guys, I'm not super duper interested in. They've kind of been like rotating pieces. Some of them have started in place of injury. Some of them have, gotten promoted and demoted out of the starting lineup. So there's not really a whole lot of consistency there, but this is one of the better game environments of the slate. And if you want to go get your value plays from it, I certainly think there's worse ideas out there. All right, that does it for all 8 games of this this Tuesday slate. So, there you have it. There's our little 8-game preview. Remember, if you want more from me, you can follow me on X at Mike's Money Picks. Join the Fantasy Corner Discord. A lot of fun in there. Read the full articles on the Patreon as well. Patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. Lastly, if you guys like what you saw here in this video, make sure you hit that like button on YouTube. Really helps me out a lot. Helps the videos get noticed. We are on the road to 300 subscribers as well. So hit that subscribe button on YouTube if you have not already. If you're listening on audio, please rate and review. Again, it really helps the videos, or in that case, the podcast, get noticed. And I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this slate. We will be back tomorrow night talking college football for bowl season. And then we will be back next week talking more college basketball as well. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so that way you can join us back next week when we're back talking college basketball. Best of luck to everybody here on this Tuesday night slate and for really the rest of the week playing DFS college basketball. Like I said at the top, I really like this Tuesday slate. I think this is going to be a fun one. I think there's a lot of options in terms of value plays. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this whole slate plays out. So that does it here for this episode, guys. If you made it this long, thank you guys for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.